Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're continuing to discuss, of course, the COVID-19 outbreak throughout the world. We're going to hone in on both the United Kingdom and the U.S. in today's show. We're going to start off in this segment speaking about the United Kingdom and how it is dealing with the coronavirus pandemic within its own borders. And we're going to hone in on three specific topics which stood out for me. One of those is a poll that was carried out by Aptos Mori on behalf of the Policy Institute at King's College London, which showed that over two-thirds of the British public think the government did act too slowly to try to control the spread of the coronavirus. The survey found that more than 40% of respondents believe the government's response to the crisis has been confused and inconsistent. Secondly, UK politicians have each been given access to an additional £10,000 in order to help them work during this coronavirus crisis. Now, this isn't something that they've signed up for themselves. This is something that they've been given an option to sign up for via the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority. That's an important detail, certainly. So this is not the MPs awarding themselves money, but it is an independent authority that is allowed for them to have access to this money. Now, this is at the same time that we know that many workers are being furloughed, even in the UK, or just simply losing their jobs altogether. And as well, we know that the health secretary at this point in time has said that it's not the appropriate time to talk about a pay rise, for example, for the most vital of workers, such as nurses and others on the front line. And thirdly, we're also then going to talk about the post-Brexit point-based immigration system that many people are now questioning, considering we've sort of redefined who are essential workers and what kind of workers we really view as quote-unquote low-skilled, because delivery drivers or others on the front line, even in grocery stores, etc., those are becoming very essential to our daily lives now as we are all respectively in our lockdowns. Does it make sense then to have them opt out or not, fulfill the points-based immigration system that the UK wants to bring forth after the entire Brexit process is complete? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by David Jeffery, who is a lecturer in British politics at the University of Liverpool. He's joining us now from Liverpool itself. And joining us now from Bournemouth is Jonathan Hines, who's co-founder and presenter at UK Talk Radio. Jonathan and David, thank you both for your time today. David, let me start with you. Let's first just talk about this poll. Do we agree that the UK was a bit slow when it came to the initial response?
Yes, I guess, in one sense, but the UK was also concerned with making sure it looked like it was following the advice of experts, of not rushing into anything, of trying to have this system whereby you, a recognition that the virus will hit the population and people will get it. It's impractical to kind of expect everybody to shut down instantly and nobody to get it, and this will pass by. Things like the Spanish flu, for example, went around the globe 3 times. So there was a recognition that people will get this. It was about having the lockdown or the shutdown at the right time, so to prevent the NHS being overwhelmed. Now, hindsight is a glorious thing, but at the time, this was something that was new to many countries, and I think there will be lessons to be learned afterwards. But I think most people generally support the restrictions that are in place. And in fact, a lot of people now, it seems, want to see them go further. So the government might not have got everything right, but I don't think it's been in any way negligent or kind of playing down a crisis. I think it's tried its best, to be fair to it.
Jonathan, I'm sure you have a criticism of Johnson and how he acted right in the initial days when this started off in the UK. Do you think that he was a bit slow to start off with the more restrictive measures that should have been in place, possibly in some people's eyes, from day one?
Yes, I mean, I'm inclined to agree with David, who just spoke a moment ago. Compared with some countries, we've done quite well, and obviously now things are very strict. But yes, there was a delay, and of course, I think that a matter of 2 weeks, which could have made so much difference if we'd maybe got our act together just 2 weeks before we actually did. But as I said before, Waqar, I think last time we spoke, it's all changed and happened and developed so fast and so quickly. Even the best of people, even the experts, couldn't quite see the dramaticness of what was about to happen. I think we've all been a bit blind and a bit short-sighted, maybe a bit over-optimistic, and it's all just come upon us so quickly. So, in a way, I can forgive, even the experts, even the powers that be, for being maybe a little bit blind and a little bit slow at first. But we've certainly made up for it now, because obviously things are really rigid and strict at the moment.
Okay, David, let's talk then about the money that MPs will now have access to. £10,000 is the additional money that they'll have access to be able to deal with this crisis. And, this money is not all just for them to spend themselves, of course, if they so choose to do so, but apparently is also to be then to help them spend vis-a-vis their own staff and to not let go of everybody. But nevertheless, the optics in any such situation, as I'm sure you can well appreciate, at a time when people like nurses are being refused to have a pay rise at this point in time, with the health secretary coming out quite strongly and saying that this is not the time to discuss that. This just doesn't look good, does it?
Well, I think it's important that we take into account what this is actually for. So that £10,000 has been granted by IPSA to support MPs' own staff, so they can't use it themselves. It's not for their own salaries, or it's to get equipment to their staff who have to work from home or who might have to work in a vastly scaled down constituency office. And I think it's right that we have this increase in funding for MPs' staff, because everything that's going on, MPs' caseloads are through the roof now. If you've got people who are working from home, they're going to need laptops, they're going to need computer equipment, whatever. And it's right that they get that. Now, the optics, I guess, can't be helped. Anytime MPs are granted an increased amount of funding, even for their office, the media do like to kind of make a bit of a song and dance about it. But I think personally it's completely necessary, because MPs need it. Well, MP staff need it, because we've got more and more people who are going to their MP because of everything that's going on. So I think it's right.
Jonathan, I wonder what you make of that, because, again, the comparison is with NHS staff, right? Frontline workers, such as nurses and others. And, Matt Hancock coming out and saying that it's not the time to discuss a pay rise for them, even though they're fulfilling really the most vital roles at this point in time. Again, that just doesn't look good, does it?
On the one hand, I'd be definitely inclined to agree with David that we need their workload has increased dramatically, and they do need quick assistance, and they need more finance. But I'm also annoyed because I notice how they're managing to organise this very, very quickly, and yet other things, money for other people who are actually in desperate need at the moment. Well, that money could take at the moment as long as June for them to receive. There are lots of people. For example, thousands of people who are self-employed, who have small businesses, and a lot of those people are already, completely broke. They can't pay their basic bills. They've got nothing. They've run out of money, and they've got no idea when they're going to get some help. And it's a long process. So, whilst I would agree with David that yes, it's an urgent time for many of our MPs and their staff, definitely. But isn't it strange that we've been able to organise that so quickly, and all the associated administration, but yet it's going to take a month, 2 months, it will take forever, you might say, to organise some small payouts for people who are absolutely desperate at the moment. So it seems to be a bit of an imbalance to me. It seems to be a bit of a contradiction, and suddenly now, before coronavirus, there was no funding for this, no funding for that, not enough police, and now suddenly, since coronavirus, suddenly we've got money for this, money for that, police everywhere. Suddenly we can do everything, but yet before coronavirus, we couldn't seem to do anything, and there was no funding for anything. Now there's like a magic wand. Do you know what I mean? And it's like,
I do, yeah.
Money for everything and everybody. How have we managed to do this so quickly?
And
now, before we couldn't do anything.
Indeed. Let me bring David into this, because David, how do you feel about that? Certainly it does seem like, the UK has been able to protect the MPs and their staff, but then what of those, as Jonathan there mentioned, who are genuinely suffering this time. And also, again, I go back to the NHS staff because I know that that's a sensitive topic within the UK. And of course, those people anywhere in the world, really, medical staff are doing and fulfilling vital roles for all of us, really.
Well, I think one of the things that makes it easier for this help for MP staff to come through is that there was already a mechanism for doing that, right? IPSA can just make this allowance, and the process by which that is done, it's already set up. The same with unemployment benefits or universal credit. It was very easy to get money to people who were laid off or who needed that unemployment support because we already had those mechanisms in place. Whereas for the self-employed, it was much more difficult because the mechanisms for understanding how much people earned were less rigorous, less robust, and there was no way that kind of already existed to get this money to people who are self-employed. Now, the point about nurses and NHS frontline staff is a good one, right? So people will be rightly asking, why aren't these people who are essential workers paid more? But I do think with everything that's going on now, thinking about increasing the pay for a massive organisation like the NHS with hundreds of thousands of nurses, there are associated costs and decisions that have to be made with that you probably don't want to be making in the middle of a crisis, right? So although it is important, that is a decision that can be pushed back slightly, and so probably should, because essentially the NHS and the government have enough on their plate. But I do think we'll see after this huge public support for more spending if it means that money is going towards people who have got the UK through this. And I don't mean the politicians, I mean the nurses. I mean the janitors in the NHS, the cleaners, the support staff, everybody who's had to pull together to keep the UK safe. And I'm sure we'll see that.
Okay, so then on that topic, then let's talk about those who we now view as essential workers, right? Because not just NHS staff, as David there alluded to, it's also janitors in hospitals or other places, really, which we would now frequent in our respective lockdowns, such as grocery stores and otherwise, delivery drivers, farm and supermarket workers, home care assistants, et cetera, et cetera. The list is quite endless. And they're all categorized in general as low-skilled workers. Now, within the points-based immigration scheme that is to come into place soon, at least, according to the plan that Johnson has put forth, they would not fulfill the criteria, especially those, of course, coming from outside the UK, into the UK. What do you think of that? Do you think that should be revisited and that we've now sort of realized that these people are actually quite important for the rest of us?
Now we shouldn't be looking at those issues right now because obviously we're in a in a crisis and emergency situation at the moment. I do have strong views on immigration. I think we need a tidier, more regulated, quotas-based policy. I don't know why it has to be so complicated because most countries in the world, they have an immigration policy based on exactly what the country needs. So it should be a little bit pragmatic, and we should be able to take, what we need and who we need. A lot of people are either on one side or the other. They're very right-wing, you might say, and very anti-immigration. Then you've got the other people on the other end of the spectrum, who are maybe the other extreme, who say, immigration, without limits is great, and these people contribute so much to the economy and to the country, which they do. But I think we need something in the middle. Obviously, most people want, big change in immigration policy, but I don't know why this has to be so controversial or so difficult. Most countries in the world have a sensible immigration policy based on the needs of the country. So I don't know why we have to make it so complicated and controversial, of course.
I'm just going to come in, Jonathan, just because you're running out of time. I do apologize. David, I just want to give you a quick minute, if you can, as a final thought. On this issue of immigration, do you think that we've redefined now those who are essential for the UK? And the argument is always that Britons would not be willing to do a lot of the work that these low-skilled workers do at this point in time as well, at this time of crisis and even after.
I think actually the real issue will be once this is over, there'll be a lot of businesses that no longer exist, a lot of people who will be out of a job, sadly, and the furlough scheme won't have protected them. And so actually, there will be an argument made by many people, and I suspect by the government itself, that it should be these unemployed people who are already in the UK who should kind of have first go at these jobs. Now, whether they will, some of the jobs that are essentially like picking fruit, for example, British people typically haven't wanted to do anyway. And I suspect if you've got a strong lobby behind you, say Farmers Union, the government will relax the restrictions somewhat. But I don't think we'll see a wholesale change in what is deemed essential. Or necessary. Once this is over, we'll go back to prioritizing things like science and engineering, and not necessarily the people that we're clapping every week who are keeping the country safe.
Very well. We'll leave there as a thought, but we appreciate both David and Jonathan for their time today and giving us context, of course, of how the UK is dealing with the coronavirus pandemic within its own borders. There's been complaints, of course, about how Johnson reacted initially to this, but I imagine, as both of our guests there said, that can pretty much go for any country around the world, because none of us really, in the early days at least, appreciated how significant this entire issue was, possibly out of our own naivete or otherwise. Secondly, about this issue of UK politicians having access to money, I mean, yes, they may need that money, but then why was this so quickly, as Jonathan there said? I mean, there's a questions to be asked about how easy it is for MPs to be able to have access to extra money during these times of crises, while the rest of Britons don't have access to money, don't have access to that kind of aid to be able to just get through their daily wages or issues, or just to have bread on their table for those who have been fired or are suffering quite greatly financially at this point in time. And then there's, of course, that argument about the NHS staff deserving more pay, especially as they're fulfilling an extremely vital role for Britons at this point in time. And then finally, the conversation about the immigration points-based system, that at some level seems like it should be visited, because a lot of these workers are fulfilling roles which no other Englishman would want to fulfill at this point in time. At least that's the theory. We'll have to wait and see, of course, how all of that develops there in the UK. I'll be back with my next segment about the US and how it's dealing with the pandemic after this. Welcome back, viewers. Now, as promised, we're going to discuss the United States and how it's dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. And we're going to hone in on a report that's come out, I believe, initially by ABC News in the US, that reported that US intelligence actually knew of a rapidly spreading illness within China back in November and had been tracking it back then. Now, the National Center for Medical Intelligence, the NCMI, has denied this report that has come out in US media. Nevertheless, a number of people have said that this is true, at least those who have been quoted by ABC and other US media outlets as well. Certainly, at some level, this goes to show that because the president was seemingly, at least, given this sort of information as well, that he did initially downplay how real this threat really was, even to the US, and did not enact measures early enough to be able to stop or stem the flow within US borders. How important is that timeline, especially for a president who prides himself a lot on acting, right, in the best interest of Americans? Does he now have egg on his face, even though, of course, there's been denial on the part of, the NCMI, as I said, as well as other officials within the Trump administration? Let's discuss that further. We're now joined by Nina Burleigh, who is a political journalist. She's been widely published in U.S. media. She's also the author, most recently, of Golden Handcuffs, The Secret History of Trump's Women. She's joining us now from upstate New York. We're also joined by Barbara Benitez, who is an assistant professor at the George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs, and she's joining us now from Washington, D.C. Barbara and Nina, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. Nina, let me start with you. I know that there's obviously hearsay when it comes to this sort of report, but do you think that Trump did know a lot earlier that he acted about how real the coronavirus pandemic really was going to be as a threat to the U.S.?
Well, I think I'm sure he was warned. I mean, there's no doubt that he was warned. His other advisor, Peter Navarro, warned him as well. So it wasn't just the intelligence report. But, this is a president who prides himself on operating by instinct about what is marketable, about his brand, about what plays on television, about how he's going to get reelected. And I think, the downplaying of it was partly wishful thinking. Maybe we'll dodge this somehow. Magical thinking. I think there's a lot of that goes on with this president. He doesn't read the reports that he's given. That's been reported widely. A lot of them do color charts to get his attention. He has a short attention span. But again, for him, perception is more important than reality. And he has, this is how he operates. So I think he thought that he was going to be able to play it down and that maybe we would dodge the bullet somehow. And instead, you have these images, again, optics, so important to him, of, yesterday, the drone images of, in the wealthiest country, in the wealthiest city in the world, mass graves being dug for bodies now, which you just don't see in this part of the world normally.
Indeed, no, and Barbara, those images that Nina is talking about certainly did shock a lot of us around the world. Certainly, when the U.S. that we know, and the perception that we have about the U.S. certainly it's not living up to that, at least at this point in time. Do you think that the president did miscalculate how to handle this situation?
I have to say a strong absolutely. Picking up on some of the things that our other guest said, he is a president that doesn't listen to briefings. There was actually a report that came out much earlier in January of 2017 from the U.S. Northern Command, which pretty much discussed what would happen if such a pandemic hit the United States. And he didn't really do a whole lot back then. He doesn't listen, as Nina suggested. He's known for that. He doesn't like the briefings, and he does everything by instinct. So were we prepared? No, we were not. Does he now try to put the blame elsewhere? Of course. That's always been his tactic all along.
Indeed, and talking about placing blame elsewhere, Nina, he's come out quite strongly against the WHO. He's called it the Chinese virus. I mean, the list really goes on of him trying to find a scapegoat. Is that a fair assessment?
He's going to throw mud around until it sticks, and since he has been, let's say, strumming the xenophobic string in the United States since before he got elected. Throwing blame on China or throwing blame on any sort of international entity like the WHO really plays well with the base, because these are the same people who, 20 years ago were in a tizzy about UN black helicopters coming. These conspiracy theories about sort of international government and internationalists like George Soros, let's say. This is the base that he's talking to, these Americans who are into isolation, who are into America first. And so it's pretty easy for him to divert blame to those organizations for those people who listen to him and who are part of his natural base. Now, I don't know I don't know whether it plays well with, let's say, the suburban women or the moderates who are concerned about their, economic future, as opposed to being, really responsive to this kind of white nationalism that he promotes.
All right, let's add another voice to this conversation. We're now also joined by Nicholas Mucerino, who is an independent analyst of international affairs with a focus on the Middle East as well as U.S. foreign policy also. He's joining us now from New York. Nicholas, good morning, and thank you for joining us. Nicholas, tell us, from your vantage point, with those disturbing images that Nina had referred to earlier on about that mass grave, right, being dug up there in New York as well. Do you think that all of these images that are not coming out of the U.S. and the very worrying statistics that daily now we're bombarded with, that reality that this is really a growing pandemic within the U.S., that Donald Trump is really in trouble politically as well?
Well, Waqar, I would say that in terms of whether the pandemic is growing in the United States, you're seeing some promising signs in New York State, at least, that the curve may be flattening, as Governor Cuomo has been emphasizing very cautiously this past week. But there are other trouble spots, of course, that they're going to be keeping an eye on, such as the Midwest, Chicago, Detroit, and then further in the south, like Louisiana, where they are experiencing a very large number of cases. In terms of how this affects Trump, however, these two regions are probably very important to keep in mind, because we are still in a presidential year, and you are seeing that these states, particularly Michigan in the Midwest, and then Louisiana or Florida even in the South, were both very, very important to President Trump in 2016 during his run for office. So if you start seeing a surge in these states, particularly along the lines of what you're seeing here in the Northeast, like New York, New Jersey, and so on, it could begin to affect the president politically, because people are afraid, and people are worried when they start seeing the stores around them closed down and their loved ones getting sick. And then they see the president who comes out on television near daily, who some days he's acknowledging the severity of the crisis, other days he's continuing to deny that it's at the severity that it is, with constant promises that we'll be okay in a very short time frames that are completely disavowed by sometimes even experts within his own administration.
Okay, so Barbara, one of the things that Donald Trump said, which has stuck in my mind, and he said this, I believe, a week or so ago. I may be wrong about exact time frame, but he said that, listen, it's not my job to try to create panic, right? And I'm paraphrasing, of course, what he said, but he said that I'm supposed to be the cheerleader for the American people. I'm supposed to be an encouraging voice as well. I'm not supposed to just worry the entire public. Do you think that just in that sense, that he may have been trying to do the right thing, vis-a-vis not creating panic and not then saying, okay, we need to just lock down the entire country ASAP?
I think that creating panic and being prepared are two different things. He could have been prepared. We saw signs, okay, maybe China, we've had issues with China and viruses stemming there before, so maybe perhaps waiting. Then we saw the virus travel to Iran. From then it went to Italy. I think by the time it went to Italy, preparedness should have been where he was, even if it was going on behind the scenes. But to just kind of stand there and improvise, I think it's led to where we are now, which has been completely unprepared. You asked the question, does he have egg on his face, or was he found to be flat-footed in this situation? Yes, he was. There wasn't a lot of preparation, and there was ample warning. And even before any of this started, when one president leaves the other, they have a training where you go through things you would do in the event of a pandemic. This administration was given that. At the end of the day, I don't think it was something he was truly focused on until the numbers started to really grow. And even then, I know we spoke a little over a week ago, I had mentioned that I believe his focus was mainly on the economy, because that's what he hopes to be reelected on. And I think that should have obviously been an important factor, but that should have come secondary to putting enough medical PPEs out there for the medical and ventilators and all the other things. There should have been preparedness first, and then worrying about shoring up the economy second.
Okay, so let's talk about the economy then, Nina, because as Barbara there said, certainly that is an important aspect to all of this, because there are many Americans who have been furloughed, some even let go of their respective jobs. And, there's that worry there, isn't there? How long can this situation continue as is? What would be reasonable for this president to do then? Because he does have to balance that out, right? So, I mean, it's certainly easy from, I would imagine, from even my vantage point to criticize him and say, listen, you should just enact a complete lockdown. You should have done it a lot quicker, et cetera, et cetera. But then there is that very real worry about, those who don't make a lot of money, McDonald's workers, for example. I mean, the list is really endless. How does one deal with that in a reasonable fashion?
Well, how does one deal with it in a reasonable fashion, and how does Trump and company deal with it are two different things, I think, because, the Trump regime really is controlled by these people who are, ideologues on the economy and on the not having a social net, on, really hardcore capitalism. There's this a Hobbesian world, I like to say, the notion that, you compete, and if you succeed, you succeed, and if you fail, you're down, and you can stay down. This is the ideology, extreme conservative capitalism that really is running the ship there behind the scenes. And so I don't know enough about, I mean, I'm not an expert. I'm not a medical expert. I'm also sitting here wishing that I could go back to work and everything go back to normal in New York and we can go back out. I think maybe they will do this state by state thing eventually, where, you know, some places will open and others won't. And in some ways that makes sense to me. You know, it is not as extremely contagious, or it's not as widespread in certain parts of the country. They're sparsely populated. Maybe they can let the farms go back to work. I don't know. But I think that ultimately you have to understand that this regime is run by these people who are, you know, they are opposed to any kind of social net. And so the problem is that, as you pointed out, there are all of these workers who are, you know, living paycheck to paycheck. Yeah. And I don't know what happens to them in 6 months if they're not getting fed. You know, it's a very, very bleak picture for them. And I'm not sure that these ideologues are going to release, you know, the stimulus package is basically just shoveling more money from the middle up to the top. I mean, it's not aimed at these lower people, lower income people.
And Nicholas, I'm going to give you the final word. Just for briefly, if you can, just tell us about the foreign policy angle of this, because we just recently had that entire tiff with Canada as well, right, over those face masks, and how Donald Trump enacted at that point in time an act which gave him the right to essentially ensure that there were enough masks within the country for Americans' use. But then he seems to also be faltering on the foreign policy aim, because, I mean, if Canada's right there, it's a neighbor, and it's an important neighbor, and it's not like it's a neighbor that the United States has, you know, issues with. It's a peaceful neighbor. So why, you know, pick that sort of fight at all?
Well, the main reason why Trump and his team may be opting for a fight is because they want to be seen as a fighter. You see how the president has set the tone for this fight with Canada, or even with the Europeans for that matter, where not too long ago Germany and other European countries were complaining that the United States was trying to buy out a company that was developing a treatment or a vaccine for COVID-19. And in a sense, it points to a very contradictory stance that's in the domestic realm for the administration as well, where they've downplayed the significance at home, but at the same time they're taking these measures to hoard resources and to blame the virus on somebody else. And it's also interesting to see how the president has soured very quickly on the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization, yes, did have some mistakes when it came to early reporting on the virus and early guidelines, but every government at the time was either following the WHO's word, or they didn't have complete information either, and many were caught as off guard as the United States when the virus began to reach its peak. But now we see some of the old 2017 even Trump rhetoric and foreign policy returning, where you have advisors speaking about defunding WHO, diverting it to alternative organizations, which is still unclear what alternative organizations they actually mean, or if such alternative organizations even exist. Indeed. But it's being framed as President Trump taking on these international interests that are preventing him from assisting Americans to his maximum capacity.
All right, we'll leave there as a final word, but we appreciate, of course, all three of our guests for speaking to us this morning. That was Nina and Nicholas, both speaking to us there from New York. Nina was in upstate New York, and Barbara was speaking to us there from Washington, D.C. Viewers, we've gone through quite a bit here, but certainly Donald Trump seemingly has been caught off guard when it comes to this virus pandemic, as have really, if we're completely honest, any global leader, because no one really expected it to be this widespread and to spread this quickly around the world as well. Nevertheless, when he knew the things were bad through his own intelligence reports, which possibly, as Nina said, he may not have even read, But nevertheless, he was told back in November, according to the reports, if we believe them, that ABC News and others have released, if that is true, so Trump knew quite early on through this massive intelligence machine of the United States that there was a rapidly spreading virus within China. So then why didn't he act to at least put in preventive measures for the U.S.? Why didn't he act to at least have preparations in place when it, for example, hit Italy, as Barbara there said? What excuse did he have at that point in time? Why did he keep downplaying it even then, saying that this would just be like a normal flu and that it would just be over and done with in no time? By Easter, we all remember that time frame that he had put forth for the rest of us around the world and for Americans. It didn't pan out that way. It's a lot more serious. Even his tone is now more somber at some level. But he is very worried about the economy, as all of our guests have also mentioned. And he keeps picking fights with his allies around the world, be it the Europeans or even the Canadians, which just defies logic, really, over face masks. I mean, he should not be, at this point in time, seeking more enemies around the world, because certainly the U.S. actually needs all of those countries' help, too, which we know he has been asking for, especially the South Koreans and others, for ventilators, etc. So this just, again, defies logic. All those who support Trump would certainly say he's doing the best he can within this context. As I said, every leader around the world is dealing with this in their own respective manners with the situation that they have to deal with in front of them. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.